Welcome to End Times TV. I'm Tom Hughes. This is Today in Prophecy. My guest today is best-selling author Bill Salus. Bill, it's great to have you with me today.
Tom, thank you so much.
And we have a lot to talk about. We have a President, Donald Trump, been elected back in November. He's made a lot of promises on his campaign. There's a lot of questions. A lot of Christians believe that he's God's anointed for the hour. We look at things that are happening in the world. We're watching what's happening in Israel. And I have a lot of questions, and I believe you can help myself and our audience work through some of these things. So let me ask you this. You ready to start?
I am, Tom.
Let's get going. First question I have for you is, will Donald Trump be able to fulfill his primary campaign promise to make America great again?
Well, that's a great question. And you know, you made the comment as you opened up that he made a lot of promises along the campaign trail. He made approximately about 76 promises.
It's a lot of promises.
Build a wall, defund Planned Parenthood, repeal Obamacare. Important, powerful promises. With the primary purpose of making America great again, because American exceptionalism has gone by the wayside. And his message apparently resonated strongly with a lot of Americans who felt the same concerns. The truthful answer, though, really is can Donald Trump make America great, when reality is only one being can make America great again, and that is God, who did greatly bless this country throughout time. I'm going to quote Acts 17:26 on that if I can. It says that he has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and their boundaries of their dwellings. It is God who pre-appoints these things. God made America great and blessed us because he put forward upon us monumental tasks to be a safe haven for the Jewish people. That's why we have about 5 million Jewish people in our country still, the second largest population in the world. To be a beacon of Christianity to the nations of the world, to preach the gospel far and wide. And throughout the church age, we probably accomplished that more as a nation than any other. And to be instrumental in the reestablishment of the nation of Israel. Of course, Harry S. Truman was the #1 first world leader to come forward with that. So we have been blessed accordingly, but the question really is at this point is, has God come back into the fold? Because we've been straight-arming God out of our society, our government, and our culture over the last 6 decades.
And that's society and the culture in general that has done that, from schools to the media. Churches even have eliminated God from the pulpits, or certainly the need for teaching on repentance and sin, and you're only saved through Christ. Those things have been set aside. So we're looking at things, it appears to many who are Christians, that they're looking and saying, okay, Donald Trump is God's man for the hour. Now, I can look at that, and I have a few different opinions on it. I want to hear yours, but let's go back in history to Harry Truman. Because of Harry Truman, we have the UN vote, Israel's a nation, right? 1948. We fast forward, Ronald Reagan was pretty favorable towards Israel, but he still wasn't great towards Israel. I mean, you can look at some of the things Ronald Reagan did, and you wonder some of the people in his cabinet and so forth. Nixon actually supported Israel at various times. But when you look at all of those men, you come to Donald Trump, it appears if there's a president that has any intention of really supporting Israel, the way we would look at Genesis chapter 12, for example, it appears to be what Donald Trump says he's going to do. And it really seems he's going to follow through with that. Is this God's doing, God's blessing the United States? What's your take on this? Did God anoint Donald Trump for this time?
Well, that's a pretty loaded question.
Yeah, it is a loaded question.
There's a whole lot of answers I'm going to throw at that one, and I'm going to come back to answer the question. But we need to remember that America, over those past 6 decades, even during the time of Nixon, on back through before then with Kennedy and stuff, had started crossing these dangerous biblical boundaries of taking God out of the prayers and the Bible reading in the schools. Our children don't need to know about you anymore, God. This sort of thing. On through abortions at the time of Nixon. Kennedy was back in the 60s, and on through this whole period of time through the Supreme Court decisions, to the point where the last 8 years we can't defend the constitutionality of the Defense of Marriage Act, which is one man should be married to one woman, which is the biblical perspective of marriage, to the fact that now we have Obergefell versus Hodges with the approval of same-sex marriages. Okay, I say that to say this. One of the dangerous biblical boundaries in that list also is anti-Semitism, and the Obama administration had pushed Israel far away. Now, you now mentioned Donald Trump is coming back in, and he's very pro-Israel. Okay, now God could bless us through that aspect, because he says he'll bless those who bless Abraham in Genesis 12:3, extrapolates through Isaac his son, Jacob his grandson, the 12 tribes, on through to Israel today. That's God's foreign policy to the Gentiles, issued 4,000 years ago. It's still effectually intact. And that's positive news that Donald Trump and most of the Republican administration in the House and Senate are also pro-Israel at this point in time. So I'm looking forward to that. But my question to you and to Americans are, have we invited God back into the country, or is God positioning America for what he's about to do prophetically? You know, there are ancient parchments, ancient prophecies written on the parchments that are, I believe, are about to roll off those parchments, pound on the pavement, and pack a powerful global punch. Yeah. And those are Middle East centered, and they will affect Americans. And I believe America may be positioned more for that, God positioning us rather than us positioning God back into our country.
Yeah, I want to get into some of these prophecies because they are pretty significant. But let me ask you this before we get to those. Do you think that America is experiencing a Nineveh moment? And what is a Nineveh moment? Maybe you can explain that to some of the audience who will be watching this.
Well, that's interesting. You know, I'm going to do a couple quotes on this one to explain it. You know, Franklin Graham, who is Billy Graham's son, a good representation of evangelical Christendom in America, he came out before the elections in March and he said, you know, we have taken God out of the public debate. I want to bring him back in. Okay, after the elections in December, he comes out and says, I believe God intervened in the elections, referring to Donald Trump. He says, in my opinion, he says, that God answered the prayers of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Now, many of those prayers were along the lines of what you're talking about. And that's having a Nineveh moment. And in essence, we go back to 2 Chronicles 7:14, which many pulpits have been praying over the last several decades, or seeing America slip away from God, which is, if my people who are called by my name would humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I would hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. Franklin Graham's sister, Anne Graham Lotz, was recently echoing that sentiment. That was the mantra going out. And if we did repent, God's people, then we could have this Nineveh type moment. So this scenario was in Nineveh around 760 BC. They were very wicked, the Assyrians, and Jonah went, the story, Jonah and the whale, went to Nineveh, and he said, you know, you'll be destroyed in 40 hours, I believe it was. And the king of Nineveh and all the people repented. They had that 2 Chronicles 7:14 kind of moment. And the Lord relented. We're told in Jonah 3 verse 10. The Lord relented from that judgment. Ultimately, Assyria was destroyed in 612 BC, I believe it was, by the Medes and the Babylonians. So the question is, could that happen to America? And absolutely it could. We could have a Nineveh moment. But my personal suspicion is that's not really what's going on, because we've got the same-sex marriage scenarios, the abortions, we're killing about 1 million per year. And I don't particularly think this administration is going to try to overturn those types of things. You know, it's one thing to build a wall for immigration and to overturn Obamacare and to try to dismantle Iran's nuclear program, which I want to get into that in a minute. That's actually a good thing. Yeah. But some of the things he's planning on doing, I don't necessarily think that God's extremely concerned about those things as much as he would be of homosexuality and, you know, redefending DOMA, the Constitution.
And let me ask you about that. In fact, I think you said 612 BC, the Assyrians defeated, I think it might have been like 712 or something like that. Is that right? Because I think it was Babylon that came in to Judah and Jerusalem about 596 BC, somewhere right in there. But I look at that and the timing of it, and you have the time frame from the destruction of Assyria. And God was also very patient before he came and had Babylon come into Jerusalem too. So we see the long suffering of God, the patience of God working in the lives of people. But you have prophecies that you would call them the NOW prophecies that we could say might take effect any moment. So are we having a Nineveh moment where God's long suffering, he's going to hold off on America and judgment coming for, I believe, you look at how many abortions, 60 million abortions that America has committed. That blood from those babies is not going to go unanswered by God. We have gay marriage. We can start looking across the board, a lot of things like you mentioned. And I'm thinking, I don't know. We're coming up on a break in just a second, but let me ask you this. All right, just what are some of the prophecies? Because you believe, and I think you may very well be right, that we don't have any time left, or very limited time. What are some of the prophecies? And then we'll come back to looking at those in some more detail in just a minute.
Sure, I believe there's a prophecy dealing with Iran. It's a disaster in Iran. I believe there'll be a destruction of Damascus. I believe there'll be a toppling of Jordan, probably a terrorization of Egypt in Isaiah 19, a concluding Arab-Israeli war in Psalm 83, a rapture, a vanishing of the Christians, the expansion of Israel territorially, not the contraction, and the decline of America. I believe that's an issue. I see us in prophecy in perhaps Ezekiel 38, verse 13, the merchants of Tarshish and their young lions in a compromised, less than superpower position. These are prophecies that lack preconditions. They're imminent. I call them the NOW prophecies because they could happen at the present time.
Believe there's prophecies that could take place at any moment. You've listed them in your book, the NOW Prophecies, which is exciting, by the way. I would encourage anybody that's watching this to pick up that book, the NOW Prophecies, by my guest Bill Salus. But with that, let's go through some of these things. You ready?
Yeah, let me make a quick comment on what you said in the introduction, because it's very important. Concerns for Americans. This is a new presidential administration coming in, heavily stacked, of course, with the Republican administration. And we need to remember that God is neither Republican or Democrat. He's a theocrat. He's one who rules over a theocratic, not a democratic government. And so, you know, there's some good things we can talk about, and there's some new hope that we can have, with especially the pro-Israel aspects we talked about in the prior segment. But we need to remember that it's only God who can make America great again, and God is neither party-oriented. He is a theocrat. So, yeah, now my concern is is this an indication with these election results of 2016 that God has been coming back into America now, that he's now got the American flag draped around him in heaven, and he's humming the Star-Spangled Banner? Is it that, or is God positioning America as a superpower to use it for the purposes he has in store for fulfilling Bible prophecies, which is what I suspect? So, for instance, America can neutralize Russia a little bit now, and it's emboldening Israel. Donald Trump's talking about moving the embassy into Jerusalem, something Israel's wanted forever, their eternal city, their eternal capital. You know, so I'm more inclined that we are not necessarily having invited God back in the country in as much as God is inviting us to the big show.
Yeah. And I think you may very well be right. We're going to watch all of this play out unless these things play out after we're raptured. But let's get into some of these prophecies that you believe could happen at any time. And in order, I believe they are chronological in your listing. You have the disaster in Iran from Jeremiah chapter 49.
Exactly. This is a prophecy that I think it's on the top of my list of events that could happen. When we talk about the NOW prophecies, these are prophecies that could happen at the present time. They lacked preconditions. I mean, you could wake up literally tomorrow and this event could happen. And Jeremiah wrote around 596 BC a prophecy in Jeremiah 49 verses 34 through 39 dealing with Elam, E-L-A-M, which is a portion of modern-day Iran. It hugs the Persian Gulf. It's where the Bushehr nuclear reactor is. It's a nuclear disaster waiting to happen. And what Jeremiah says, he says that a time would come when the Lord would be fiercely angry with the leadership of Iran. He says this because he will destroy the kings and the princes from there in this prophecy. And you would not destroy good kings and princes. You would not destroy Persia, Cyrus of Persia, remember around 635 BC, because Isaiah tells us in chapter 44 and 45 he was his anointed.
Cyrus was used by the Lord, and he blessed the Jews.
Yeah, and that's an important point. God, that's what I'm saying about America. God can use empires for his purposes, and he used the Persian Empire to get the Jews out of 7 years captivity and go back into Israel out of Babylonian captivity. But he's going to destroy some bad leadership, because it says in the prophecy they want to launch something lethal somewhere. He says he's going to break their bow at the foremost of their might. So he's going to disable them from being able to launch this something lethal somewhere. And what is that lethal weapon, and what is that target? And I suspect that could be Israel, and I suspect that could be a nuclear weapon. So I see this as a potential nuclear prophecy, with also the fact that the details specify there'll be a disaster caused because the Lord is fiercely angry with this leadership. And it says that once this disaster happens, the bow is broken at the foremost of its might. The indigenous population will be dispersed into the nations of the world. It says there will be no nations where the outcasts of Elam do not go. It's a worldwide dispersion. Sounds like a humanitarian crisis. You know, Tom, I'm under the impression that that nuclear facility and the nuclear program in Iran is going to be dealt with on a military confrontation.
Yeah.
It says it will be pursued by the sword. It's an earthquake-prone area, but it says it'll be pursued by the throne, that Iran will have enemies, plural, at the time. By
the sword.
We see it, we see it by the sword, excuse me. And we see that's the case right now. They have multiple enemies concerned right now.
Right, and then we also have the Iran contract with America. We have Russia and the supply of these things, and these things are really have gotten out of hand. So it'll be interesting to see how Trump deals with that whole thing. So we move from this prophecy to Damascus, Isaiah chapter 17.
Right, and just by the way, a side note on the Iran-Trump policy, he has threatened that he might want to dismantle that JCPOA, Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action deal that the P5+1 put together, and trust me, that will be very hard to do.
It will be hard to do.
Because Russia is part of the P5+1, and they've already got 2 extra contracts to build nuclear reactors in that same area. And there's other reasons as well. India's got large oil contracts with Iran. China is very concerned. They're spending money in Iran now. So, you know, some of these promises that Donald Trump have made, moving the embassy, dismantling the Iran nuclear deal, these are going to be very important things to watch. Now, disaster in Iran and destruction of Damascus.
Destruction of Damascus, Isaiah 17.
Yeah, well, many of your viewers are probably familiar with this prophecy. Hal Lindsey's taught about it. I think you taught about it on your show before and stuff. And it's a big deal. The destruction of Isaiah 17:1 says Damascus will cease from being a city. It will be a ruinous heap. We read the next several verses down to verse 9, and it appears to be that in self-defense, verse 9 says Israel will cause the desolation. It says the strong cities, not just Damascus, but other strong cities there will be desolation caused by the children of Israel, the Israeli Defense Forces. And then the real-time application, as you read the final verse in Isaiah 14, it says, at eventide you see Damascus, speaking of Damascus in the masculine pronoun, in the morning he is no more. Israel has those technologies to take out that city. And what's real livid about this prophecy, real active, is even as we speak about within the last week, Israel has struck an airport near Damascus because they're concerned about the flow of weapons going from Iran through Syria into Hezbollah, who is another problem. They've got about 150,000 missiles, high-tech missiles pointed at Israel.
Hezbollah is a much bigger threat than ISIS is. And when you're in the Golan Heights, you've been there before, and I've been there, you're in the Golan Heights. Damascus is not far from the Golan Heights of Israel. It's actually quite close. So we have that. Then we have the toppling of Jordan, another prophecy.
Yeah, you know, this is interesting. People would think, well, Jordan is that moderate Arab state. They've got a treaty with Israel from 1994. And how could anything bad go with Jordan? Which, by the way, they were very upset when Donald Trump said he's going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. They called that a red line, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, Jordan has the authority over the Temple Mount because Jewish government has given it to him.
The Waqf, W-A-Q-F. Well, Jeremiah 49 verses 1 through 6 says that there's going to be alarm of war in Rabbah of the Ammonites, which would be Amman, Jordan, is the capital of Jordan. It says it shall be a desolate mound, which sounds very much like what happens with Damascus. By the way, Ammon and Damascus are about as close as, I'm not sure on this, but somewhere between Los Angeles and San Diego, if you're familiar with the West Coast. So basically, you know, the situation is, it says Israel will then take possession of its inheritance. So as a result of the war, Israel will take possession of its inheritance. So why would Israel take possession of its inheritance unless Israel was the victor, right? Yeah. And I see Ammon in Psalm 83, the concluding Arab-Israeli war. But what's interesting about this prophecy, it goes on to say that a fear will engulf Jordan. In Jeremiah 49, I think it's like verses 4 and 5. It will engulf Jordan. And that fear has never existed until it does right now. It says from all sides, Jordan will be driven out headlong and no one will bring it back. So we need to look at that prophecy more closely. That fear is engulfing Jordan right now. To the north with the wars going on in Syria and Hezbollah's weapons, with Iran to the east wanting to maybe fire something nuclear at Israel's way. The Sinai is concerned with them, the ISIS terrorism coming through. The refugees coming in through from the east there, from Iraq and Syria. Jordan, King Abdullah II of Jordan is basically panicking, to be quite honest with you at this point. He can't deal with this issue.
He's not too thrilled about it. Another one, terrorization of Egypt.
Egypt, in Isaiah 19 verses 1 through 18. This one's going to be a little more controversial. Egypt is the subject of several end times Bible prophecies. I believe they're involved in Psalm 83 under the banner of the Hagarenes. But what Isaiah says is that there's going to come a time the Lord will fly in on like a swift cloud, the burden against Egypt, that the city will come, brother will come against brother, city against city, kingdom against kingdom, dealing with expanding from civil disobedience, civil war into a regional conflict. And we go all the way through, and all of Egypt pretty much collapses. All who make wages are troubled of soul. And it says that there's a terror, and we don't find out till about verses 16 through 18, that it's Israel. There's a terror concern about Judah, and that fear turns into a terror. And then it says in Isaiah 19, verse 18, that 5 cities in the land of Egypt will speak the language of Canaan, which is Hebrew.
You see the Egyptians turning to the Lord. You see Assyria, ancient Assyria territory, those people turning to the Lord in the last days. I'm with my friend and good friend and best-selling author Bill Salus, author of Psalm 83, the NOW Prophecies, Revelation Road, and you have your newest book out, The Next Prophecies.